All right, this is going to be the first PowerPoint lecture for Chapter 8. The title of this lecture is American History Unit 4, Lecture 3, Reforming America. American society changes. So from 1820 to 1860, we see a lot of rapid changes in American society. We've talked about transportation inventions, we've talked about the canals, we've talked about new roads. We haven't yet talked about the railroad, but that will be coming. We also see a lot more immigrants coming to the United States. We've talked a little bit about westward expansion. We've seen industrial growth in the North more so, and we see this growing controversy over slavery. We also see communication technology improve um, as well to get news and communications uh, across the country a lot faster. And the era of reform can be seen as a response to these rapid changes in society. So this whole chapter that we'll be talking about will be called the era of reform, and reform means change. Okay, so we'll see some changes um, come about. So the market economy. The market economy and following the Industrial Revolution, the United States shifts to a market economy. So, what is a market economy? It is where goods and services are purchased rather than self produced. Okay. So people aren't making their own clothing. People aren't making their own clocks. And we talked a little bit about this. This came about because of the Industrial Revolution, because of the interchangeable parts. And then this word capitalism makes the market economy possible. We also see a standard of living increases for most Americans in the United States. So people are not making their own tables, chairs, clocks. They're not making their own clothing. They're buying it from businesses or companies or other people who do make those things. Okay. So transportation connects the nation. We've talked a little bit about transportation, but we see steamships and canals start to crisscross the landscape. Railroads are beginning to grow steadily, and new roads decrease travel time. And all three of these new transportation inventions do decrease travel time across the United States, not only for people that are just physically traveling, but also news, mail. Okay, the inventions and these new inventions start to improve daily life. We have this communication invention called the telegraph, developed by Morse, and obviously we know what Morse code is, allows for long distance communication. Okay, they communicated through a series of beeps and dashes, or long beeping noises and short beeps to represent letters, and then they obviously put those letters into words and sentences, and now people are communicating. Um, Singer develops a sewing machine that reduces clothing prices. So now we see, we don't think of the sewing machines today. These sewing machines were had to be run by a foot pedestal that would then make the needle go up and down, so people aren't sewing by hand. So now you can start mass producing clothing because you can pump it out faster. And then Goodyear developed the vulcanized rubber, which would then be used for eventually the automobile. Innovation changes life. Agricultural tools. Americans are moving west to farm. We talk about Southerners moving out to the Midwest. John Deere will develop a series of steel plows to enhance farming techniques. Cyrus McCormick invented a mechanical reaper, and both of these things allow for more efficient farming. We also see factories start to become more widespread, and in these factories we see rapid production of goods, and that would in which increases the supply and then lowers the cost of that good. Okay, we also see a decline of skilled labor. Um, People aren't specializing, or factories don't need people to specialize in making a certain product. Anybody off the street could run a certain machine to make a certain product. So we see this is the beginning of mechanization. So there's really no more uh, specialty machinists or specialty makers of anything anymore. We also see some um, a social reaction to all these changes. We see a second Great Awakening. I know it's been a few chapters since we talked about the first Great Awakening, but the second Great Awakening was again a religious revival led by the name of a guy named Charles Finney, and it stressed individual responsibility for salvation. Okay, they have these tent revivals, and then we see a large scale conversion of African Americans to Christianity during this time. We also have a social change or a social movement that was called transcendentalism, and this was a less traditional reaction to society's changes. And what transcendentalism stressed was the importance of a simple life in balance with nature and individual dignity. An author you may have heard of was Henry David Thoreau, and he kind of wrote about that in a book called Civil Disobedience. And transcendentalism kind of goes along with a utopian society. So, a utopian, or the definition of a utopian society, would be like a perfect society. And these communal societies were founded as alternatives to traditional society. One was called, or was located in New Harmony, Juanita, or New Harmony and Juanita were examples, and I believe these cities were located in like Ohio or Illinois or Iowa, but they failed to catch on. There was no like president or ruler in these utopian societies. Everybody was kind of about like the group governing over everybody, and they don't really become popular. But people kind of talk about utopian societies as like the perfect world or the perfect society. And they tried to recreate that then, but it just really didn't catch on. Reformers during this time period address problems. So there was a lot of talk about education reform during this time, and there was no standard policy for school attendance. Kids didn't have to go to school if they didn't want to, um, and they didn't have to like finish or graduate. And most kids' educations ended at the age of 10. Well, Horace Mann was an education reformer, and he advocated for public school reform to, keep kids in school, make sure that they graduated. Another education reformer was Noah Webster, obviously from Webster's Dictionary, and he developed the first standard dictionary. Other reforms happened in what we call institutions, and we have the two institutions were prisons and mental hospitals. The conditions in prisons and mental hospitals from the 1820s to the 1860s were not good at all. So you have a lot of people that tried to reform and change and make those conditions a lot better, and one of those was Dorothea Dix, and she begins a movement to reform. She was just one of the many to help reform these two institutions. American literature and art. By the early to mid 1800s, there was a distinctive American culture that was now portrayed in art and literature. Gone were the was the art and literature of Great Britain, and you might say, well, why Great Britain? Well, the 13 original colonies were the colonies of Great Britain, so art and literature influenced were influenced in the colonies at the time up until then. And now we finally have really American, what we can call American authors and American artists who had lived and grown up and were born in America. You have authors like Nathaniel Hawthorne, who wrote The Scarlet Letter, Herman Melville, who wrote Moby Dick, Edgar Allan Poe, wrote the poem The Raven. James Fenimore Cooper wrote Last of the Mohicans. And then you have Washington Irving, who wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, Ralph Waldo Emerson, who we've talked about, Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson, Alexander de Tocqueville wrote Democracy in America. So this guy Alexander was a French guy, and he wrote these series of papers on why the United States democracy had worked and had sustained for so long, why other democracy in other countries had failed. Um, you also have like public schools like the Hudson River School, and painters would go there to capture American landscapes. Um, and the Hudson River School was more so like a boarding school in upstate New York. And here are just some of those um, literature books that I had talked about. And then we see, painters are painting landscapes. Obviously, this is Niagara Falls, and painters are painting more unique American landscapes to portray American culture during this time.